What does it mean to rule an empire and your own mind? In the heart of ancient Rome, a man sat alone in his tent on the battlefield. By torchlight, he did not write about war or conquest, but about how to be calm in the face of rage, kind amid cruelty, and humble while wearing a crown. His name was Marcus Aurelius. History knows him as the last of the 5 good emperors, but philosophy remembers him as something greater, a Stoic, a thinker, and the author of Meditations, a book still read today, 2,000 years later. He ruled over one of the greatest empires in history, and yet he spent much of his life trying to understand how to live a good one. Before he was emperor, before he led armies and shaped the fate of Rome, Marcus Aurelius was simply a boy with a thoughtful mind and a quiet spirit. Born on April 26, 121 AD, in Rome, he came into the world with every advantage: noble blood, family wealth, and access to Rome's best education. But even from a young age, Marcus showed little interest in luxury. He preferred simplicity, wearing plain clothes, sleeping on the floor, and embracing discomfort not as punishment, but as training. His father died early, leaving Marcus to be raised by his mother, Domitia Lucilla. She was cultured, strong-willed, and intelligent. From her, he inherited not just discipline, but also a sense of moral clarity. His grandfather, too, played a role, instilling in him a sense of public service and duty to the Roman state. Marcus's seriousness and honesty caught the attention of Emperor Hadrian. The emperor saw promise in the boy and arranged for Marcus to be adopted into the imperial succession line. When Hadrian died, his successor, Antoninus Pius, adopted Marcus as his son and heir. At only 17 years old, Marcus was bound for the throne, not because he sought it, but because it was placed in his path. He accepted the role not with ambition, but with humility and a growing sense of responsibility. Education became the core of his early life. He was trained in rhetoric, law, poetry, and politics, but what most deeply moved him was philosophy. In particular, he became devoted to Stoicism, a school of thought that taught that virtue was the only true good, and that external things like wealth, fame, and even pain or death were ultimately indifferent. Stoicism promised not power but peace. It taught that human beings should live in harmony with reason and nature, and that what mattered most was not what happened to you, but how you responded. One of Marcus's most influential teachers was Junius Rusticus, a Stoic philosopher who introduced him to the works of Epictetus. Epictetus, once a slave, taught that freedom was not a matter of status, but of self-mastery. His teachings planted the seed of a lifelong discipline to govern one's mind, to act justly, and to live without complaint. Under Rusticus's guidance, Marcus learned how to examine himself daily, how to welcome hardship, and how to treat others with fairness no matter their rank or conduct. Rather than use his education to sharpen political skills alone, Marcus turned inward. He began writing what would become the private reflections known today as Meditations. They weren't essays or treatises, but short personal entries, reminders to himself to stay calm, to live simply, to be patient and forgiving, and to remain grounded amid fame and power. He wrote not to impress others, but to shape his own character. He reminded himself that anger is a weakness, that death is natural, and that each day is a chance to be better than the last. Throughout his 20s and 30s, Marcus studied law and governance under Antoninus Pius, who reigned as emperor with restraint and wisdom for 23 years. Marcus admired Antoninus deeply, especially for his steady mind and sense of duty. He studied him not just as a ruler, but as a role model in Stoic living. Antoninus rarely lost his temper, showed no greed, and kept to a simple life despite his immense power. Exactly the kind of leadership Marcus hoped to emulate. By the time Marcus turned 40, he was no longer the uncertain youth of his early studies. He had spent more than 2 decades preparing, not with fanfare or glory, but with focus. He had mastered Greek and Latin, law and military command, but more importantly, he had begun to master himself. He saw leadership not as a reward, but as a responsibility. He believed that philosophy was not meant to be talked about, but lived. A good man, in his view, was measured not by words but by actions. War and Wisdom, 169, 177 AD. By 169 AD, Marcus Aurelius was the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Lucius Verus, his co-emperor and adoptive brother, had died suddenly, likely of the plague that was devastating the population. The weight of leadership now rested entirely on Marcus's shoulders, and the challenges ahead would test not only his strength, but the core of his Stoic philosophy. As the empire reeled from the Antonine plague, new threats emerged along the northern frontiers. Germanic tribes, including the Marcomanni and Quadi, began pressing into Roman territory across the Danube. The stability of the empire, already strained, now faced a military crisis. Marcus, though often thought of as a philosopher first, was no stranger to war. He donned the armor of a general, left the comfort of Rome, and led his armies to the front lines. For much of the next decade, he lived among soldiers in military camps, enduring the same cold, hunger, and danger they faced. He refused special treatment and led by example. His presence inspired discipline, loyalty, and a shared sense of purpose. It was during these brutal campaigns, far from the marble halls of the Senate, that Marcus wrote most of Meditations. Late at night in his tent, surrounded by war and uncertainty, he reflected on life, death, and duty. These writings were never meant for anyone else. They were personal reminders, a form of inner discipline to keep his mind steady while the world around him was crumbling. You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. The writings of Meditations are not grand proclamations. They are raw, honest thoughts, often repetitive, sometimes weary, always grounded in the effort to remain virtuous in the face of hardship. They show a man who, despite commanding armies and governing millions, still struggled with anger, fatigue, and doubt, but he always returned to his principles. The war in the north dragged on for years. The tribes were skilled and relentless, and the terrain was unfamiliar and harsh. Rome's legions suffered defeats, supply shortages, and internal dissent. At one point, a general named Avidius Cassius declared himself emperor in the east, believing Marcus to be dead. It was a betrayal that could have torn the empire in two. But Marcus, true to his Stoic training, remained calm. He did not react with rage or panic. When the rebellion collapsed, and Cassius was assassinated by his own soldiers, Marcus refused to punish Cassius's family or supporters. He preferred forgiveness over revenge, mercy over spectacle. He believed that cruelty only multiplied suffering in the soul of the ruler and in the lives of the ruled. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injustice. Even in war, Marcus emphasized moral responsibility. He issued strict orders to avoid unnecessary brutality. When victorious, he treated defeated tribes with fairness, often allowing them to settle within Roman borders under negotiated terms. He did not see his enemies as monsters, but as fellow human beings acting from fear and survival, just like his own people. Through his choices, he demonstrated that strength need not come at the cost of virtue. He believed that inner peace could coexist with outer conflict, and that a man could remain just even when surrounded by injustice. Yet these years also brought deep personal sorrow. Marcus lost more children to illness, bringing the total to at least 6 over his lifetime. His beloved wife, Faustina, who had accompanied him on several campaigns, died in 175 AD. Though rumors and criticism followed her in life, Marcus always defended her character and honored her memory. Still, he did not collapse under grief. He turned to his writings and to service. He reminded himself that death was natural, that all things must pass, and that to grieve is human, but to endure is divine. He was aging, weary from decades of responsibility, but his sense of duty had not dimmed. Returning to Rome, he elevated his surviving son, Commodus, to the rank of co-emperor. It was a practical decision. Marcus's health was failing, and succession needed to be secure. But the choice carried risks. Commodus, still a teenager, lacked his father's discipline and depth, while Marcus had been shaped by years of study and hardship. Commodus had grown up in privilege, shielded from the harsher lessons of life. The empire, meanwhile, remained fragile. The The Germanic tribes beyond the Danube continued to test Rome's borders. Despite years of campaigning, the frontier was never truly pacified. In 178 AD, Marcus once again left the comfort of Rome, taking Commodus with him to the northern battlefields. It would be his final campaign. Years of war and the lingering shadow of the Antonine Plague had left scars on the empire, and on Marcus himself. His body was thin, his face lined, his health in steady decline. Yet he pressed forward, sleeping in tents, enduring the same conditions as his soldiers. For Marcus, philosophy was meaningless unless it was lived. To ask men to endure hardship, he believed he must endure it too. Personal loss had been a constant companion. Of at least 14 children, only a few had survived into adulthood. His beloved wife, Faustina, had died in 175 AD, leaving him to carry the burden of grief alone. Yet he refused to let sorrow rule him. In his writings, he reminded himself that death was a natural part of life's order. Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you while you live. While it is in your power, be good. In the final years of his reign, betrayal tested his spirit as much as war tested his body. The earlier rebellion of Avidius Cassius had been followed by other whispers of disloyalty within the Senate and military. Marcus met these with the same restraint he had always shown, refusing to be consumed by suspicion or vengeance. Justice to him was not about punishing enemies, but about doing what was right regardless of personal cost. Even as he fought in the north, he continued to govern with reform in mind. He worked to ensure fair treatment for slaves, strengthened laws protecting orphans, and sought to make justice accessible to the poor. For Marcus, leadership was not about wielding power, but about using it responsibly. Yet he could not ignore the shadow Commodus cast over the future. The boy's temperament was impulsive, his interests more in sport and spectacle than in statecraft. Marcus hoped exposure to the discipline of military life would shape him, but deep down, he may have sensed that his successor would not walk the same path. In the winter of 180 AD, the campaign along the Danube reached a turning point. Roman forces were gaining the upper hand. The tribes were fractured and considering peace. But Marcus was weakening. Fever struck him during the campaign, and his condition worsened quickly. Surrounded by his generals and Commodus, he faced his final trial. He asked that his son be guided by the Senate, that mercy be shown to enemies, and that the empire remain united. There was no theatrical farewell, no grand speeches, only the quiet resolve of a man who had spent his life preparing for this. It is not death that a man should fear, but never beginning to live. Marcus Aurelius died on March 17, 180 AD, in the military camp at Vindobona, modern Vienna, or possibly in Sirmium. He was 58 years old. Soldiers mourned him deeply, and even Rome's enemies respected him. His ashes were taken back to Rome and placed in Hadrian's mausoleum, now the Castel Sant'Angelo. With his death, the era of the 5 good emperors came to an end. Commodus, his only surviving son, inherited the throne. Within a few years, his reckless rule would unravel much of what his father had built. Marcus's reign had been filled with crisis, yet he had remained steady. In the years that followed, the wisdom and example he left behind became a guide, not just for Romans, but for generations across the world. His son Commodus inherited the throne immediately. At first, there was hope that he might follow his father's example, but it soon became clear that Commodus's reign would be marked by self-indulgence, political instability, and neglect of state affairs. While Marcus had led from the front in war, Commodus preferred the arena, seeing himself as a gladiator more than a statesman. The contrast was stark, and historians often view the transition from father to son as the moment Rome began its long decline. And yet, Marcus's true legacy was not in the stability of the empire after his death, but in the ideals he embodied while alive. His reign had been one of duty over desire, service over ambition. He left no grand monuments proclaiming his greatness, no extravagant palaces to glorify himself. Instead, he left behind a book, a private notebook of reflections. never meant for public eyes, that would become known as *meditations*, written during military campaigns, in the quiet hours between battles. These notes were not political manifestos or historical records. They were reminders to himself to stay humble, to act with justice, to accept what could not be changed. He wrote as a man wrestling with his own weaknesses, determined to live according to the Stoic principles he admired. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. Over the centuries, *meditations* traveled far beyond the boundaries of the Roman Empire, copied by scribes, translated into many languages, and eventually printed in the modern era. It became one of the most influential works of philosophy and history. Leaders, soldiers, writers, and thinkers have all turned to Marcus's words for guidance, from Renaissance scholars to modern CEOs, from soldiers in wartime to ordinary people facing personal struggles. What makes his writings timeless is not their historical context, but their universality. Marcus does not speak as a distant, untouchable emperor. He speaks as a human being, someone who understands loss, frustration, and fear, yet chooses virtue and reason over resentment. He offers no promise of an easy life, only the assurance that we can choose how to meet whatever life brings. Beyond the pages of *meditations*, Marcus's life has also served as a model of leadership. In an age where power often corrupted absolutely, he demonstrated that authority could be exercised with restraint, empathy, and integrity. His reign proved that an emperor could be both strong and compassionate, decisive yet humble. Modern historians often remark that Marcus ruled more like a philosopher reluctantly called to power than a man born to it. And perhaps that is why his example endures. His influence extends into unexpected places. Military academies study his discipline and resilience. Psychologists draw on Stoic ideas, championed by Marcus, to teach emotional balance and resilience in therapy. Even in popular culture, Marcus Aurelius appears in novels, plays, and films as the archetype of the wise and noble ruler. Yet perhaps his greatest lesson is personal, not political, the reminder that each of us, no matter our station, is responsible for the state of our own soul. Marcus never claimed to have mastered himself entirely. He admitted his faults, his impatience, his moments of anger, but in striving daily to live according to reason, he showed that philosophy is not an abstract subject for scholars, but a practical tool for living. In the centuries since his death, empires have risen and fallen, borders have shifted, and countless rulers have come and gone. But the quiet voice of Marcus Aurelius still speaks across time. You have power over your mind, not outside events.